Hello again, this is Bishop Doherty from the Diocese of Lafayette-in-Indiana. The question thrown at me for today is, why does God allow suffering? Now, in the fancy education that I've had, I was taught that the person who controls the question controls the answer. So just from the question, is it true that God allows suffering? In other words, is God the source of that suffering? We would say no. But why does he allow it? How do we possibly understand that? So the question helps us to maybe ask as much a question about suffering as about God. And I'm not going to close that whole discussion here in 2 minutes. The Catholic Church explains the existence of suffering through original sin. In other words, it was through a human failure. It was through a deliberate act of distancing ourselves from God that began to cause us our pain, both physical pain in terms of our health, our mortality, the shortness of life, and so forth. Religion has dealt with this question for a long time. The whole book of Job in the Old Testament asks the question about why does God allow evil and suffering into the life of this otherwise holy man? So it's a wonderful story, and Job never turns against God, even though his friends are encouraging him to kind of give up on the Lord who's allowed him to fall into such a bad state. Another reason that suffering happens is because people have freedom. A lot of suffering that we experience is caused by other people. But you know, in the last 10, 20 years, we're more adept at understanding that people suffer from nature. There's a freedom in nature as well. And we're now getting the idea that if we've abused nature in terms of our environment, our water, our climate begins to change and people begin to suffer, especially those who live close to ocean seasides. As the level of the oceans rise, these people are being displaced by the hundreds of thousands. So there's an interplay of human freedom and an interplay of nature's whims, let's say, which now we can kind of see some causes based on our behavior. Another reason for suffering in the human experience is that we could say, some wise guy said once that suffering is caused by people who are 90% happy trying to get the other 10%. You know, think about that in your own life. Some of our dissatisfactions are not because of the 90% that we enjoy, but because there's something we're still reaching for, which maybe isn't that important to us. Another thing about suffering is we hear in our upbringing that we each have a cross to carry. There's a suffering that comes into each human life. Some of that suffering happens simply because we love other people. But we find that those who refuse to suffer and carry their own cross are inevitably forcing someone else to carry their load. And so that's why in our Catholic spirituality, we reflect on suffering as something that in large measure is going to be unavoidable. It can be endured. It can even be ennobling. It's never welcomed. It just seems to happen. It remains one of those parts of human existence that if we're honest with all of our relationships and loves, yes, we want to ask God why this happens. But we also have to ask ourselves how much of it we have caused, how much of it we're refusing to carry, and how much of it will just be simply a part of our experience. And once we recognize that everybody deals with suffering in some way, I think we can respect each other a little bit more. People at a certain age realize that everybody has carried their load, and it's made them a little bit more noble than we might have appreciated when we were quite young. God bless you.